It's, wait 1 second, it's not letting me switch screens. Let me stop the. Welcome everybody to the last in the series of fundamentals of post-exploitation. In fact, on this presentation, more than likely I'll go a bit deeper on some of the subjects. I know that some of the feedback that I actually got from other people is that they wanted me to go, if I could be a bit more technical on some of this stuff. Other people were having issues, so I'm going to try to get into a balance of going deep technical on some of the areas and then just providing simple commands for you guys to go from there and just keep exploring. And at the end, you guys will get an email with the slides, and I'm going to put as many links as references at the end of the slides. I know that we don't have enough time to cover everything, but at the very least, you guys will have quite a bit of homework for stuff that you will find useful. So for those of you that do not know me, I work at TrustedSec as the research practice lead. I'm in charge of the group that actually builds most of the cool tools that the guys actually use. And also, we do research on new TTPs, new techniques, as new exploits come out, as new stuff hits the Twitter, hits the threat intel feeds, VirusTotal, and other places. We start going through all of those samples, looking at different techniques and see what we can actually apply for all of our advanced threat emulation practices that we do in the red team and also for the force team for pen testing. I've been a presenter at many conferences, DEF CON, DerbyCon, HackerCon. I'm actually one of the organizers for B-Sides Puerto Rico. And I think I'm mostly known by most of the modules that I wrote for Metasploit and for DNS Recon. In addition to that, I've been, for the past 5 years, I've been a Microsoft MVP for the data center management practice with 2 specialties. One of them is enterprise security and the other is PowerShell. So today we are going to be going on the last 2 subjects that we mapped out a couple of months ago when we started. We're going to be covering credential harvesting and alarm movement. I do have to say that I'm sorry. My domain controller for some reason doesn't want to work. My VM, I think it is that I have a faulty SSD drive, but thankfully I got enough screenshots and everything that I can demo some of this stuff for you guys today. But I won't be doing pass the ticket and some of the other advanced Kerberos techniques that I wish I could have covered. But at the very least, I think I'll give you enough information for you guys to experiment with. So the agenda for today is we're going to go through sources of where credentials are actually stored. And then we're going to go into extraction of those credentials. I'll cover for each one of the subjects a bit of operational guidelines that you need to cover. Then we're going to look at what is the actual remote control surfaces in Windows and how we can abuse some of those. So when we look at credential locations, typically when we're doing our pen test or we're doing our engagements, we typically focus on 2 areas. The main area is anything that is operating system-based, either local or centralized. In the case of Windows, which is the one I'll focus the most, since it's the one that we target the most often, it is the local SAM store, the local users are storing the machine, and then the other side is Active Directory. And then we typically go after third-party tools. Some of my favorites are WinFTP, FileZilla, PuTTY, or PUTTY. I got to be careful. Depending on the phonetics on it, it is actually a bad word in Spanish. And also we go after credentials in memory on the systems. Now it used to be that we could just operate freely in memory, and then I would say about 10 years ago, um, AV started catching up to this, and then recently EDRs have taken it to a new level. So I'll cover a bit of memory credential harvesting, but I do have to say, as always, do test, do validate if you're in an actual engagement. So typically when we're looking at Windows, this is how Windows actually processes the entire authentication of a user. Sorry about that. So typically you have user mode, an application, when log on, something, an interface for the user that he's going to enter his credentials on the system. Either he connected via RDP, his local on the machine, or you're just connecting via SMB to the host. You have that credential logging layer. Then his credentials are going to be sent to the LSA service that we also call LSASS. And also, if you're connecting remotely, let's say via WMI or SMB, many times you're going to be also sending and connecting to the LSASS service via RPC. Then we have another component who is in charge of actually processing that credential. And depending on the target of where you're actually connecting, those credentials are going to be managed in different ways. For example, the typical one for NTLM is going to be MSV1_0. That's just going to take your hash or your credentials. It's going to MD4 those, create an NTLM hash, and then that is going to be compared against the local SAM or the local NTDS if you're logging in locally on the machine. Also, it's going to, if you're connecting to a remote server, you're going to see that remote RPC SMB connection to the remote server, and it's going to go into the connection that we see again here. So let's say laser pointer here. So here on RPC is where we're going to be connecting again. Now, if we're connecting, let's say, into a Kerberos environment, all of this is going to go to a KDC. All the main controllers are KDC in the environment. Don't worry, I won't bore you with the math of how that credential gets turned into a ASP request and then a ticket, granting ticket, and then a ticket granting service, and how all of that stuff's used. Kerberos on itself can be kind of like a 2-day subject. And then you have the PKU to U. This is when you're authenticating to, let's say, auth or external web interfaces. This provider is the one that handles that. Then we have S channel and WDigest, which is for connecting to web servers. S channel is anything TLS, SSL on the system. He's the guy that assures that connection. So if the user has a certificate, it will look for the user's certificate and then provide that for authentication via TLS on the system. WDigest is the guy that turns your credentials into basic or into an MD5, a digest for you to log into a website. Then we have CredentialSec, which is very common. For example, many environments have jump boxes. Sadly, many environments do not know how to secure jump boxes correctly. And one of the first things that they enable is CredentialSec. CredentialSec simply stores the credentials in memory. So the user, when he jumps into that box and from it he connects to another, let's say via PowerShell remoting or RDP, he doesn't have to re-enter his credentials, which is bad because that means that we need to keep a copy of those credentials in memory. This is one of the things I had as an instructor that teaches PowerShell. It is one of the things that every time I talk with students, there's always a couple in the classroom that are actually using CreditSSP in production. I have to warn them not to do it. And after a Mimikatz demo and they see credentials in clear text in memory, they kind of stop. Then we have the live SSP. I used to believe that we would never see this in an engagement, but then again, with the BYOD being so popular, live SSP is when you actually log on into Windows with your Hotmail, Live, Microsoft Passport, however you want to call it. It has gone through so many names, but it's when you log in with your Microsoft account into Windows itself. And then something that was added in recent versions of Windows, which is the Terminal Services Support, a Security Support Provider, SSP, which is specifically for RDP. They added several protections. It used to be TSKPG, and then every time you logged in via RDP, your credentials would be in clear text in memory. And then they just created this new support provider that actually has a garbage collection engine, and those credentials get cleaned from memory in a couple of minutes, and sometimes even tens of seconds before, after the credentials have been used. So all of this information is just so you understand that path of the credentials of a user when he logs in, and how they're different, how they're used, and how they're stored in different places in memory. We have a question here. Is there a specific order the providers are used if a system supports multi-providers? No, there's no specific order that I know of. Is this list of 8 the only support providers? No, you can actually have third-party providers that you can install and enable on a system. Some environments actually do disable, for example, MSV 1_0 NTLM via configuration. WDigest is disabled on most modern versions of Windows. If you're still running XP and Vista in your environment, sadly, WDigest is going to be enabled on those. CreditSSP is also disabled until you enable it. Live SSP is disabled unless you're actually logging into the system with your live credentials, and TSSP is not present unless you're have RDP installed or you're initiating an RDP session. That is not used until that place. But at the very least, the one that gets used the most, it is MSV1_0 for NTLM for backward compatibility. And in a domain environment, the one that is used the most is Kerberos. Is the second one that gets used the most. And many times what we're going to see, me going a bit deeper here, it is that if you're using TSSP, S-channel is also being used at the same time. And depending how you have configured RDP, your credentials may be in S-channel, CreditSSP, and TSSSP, because RDP can actually use TLS and run over TLS. So in those cases, it will use S-channel, and depending on how you have configured RDP, remote, admin guard, credential guard, and other stuff, CreditSSP may be enabled on the system. The TSSSP actually just provides you single sign-on for RDP. Simply when you log in via RDP to a host, it will just never ask you for credentials. It will just log you in. But it is something that you have to enable by hand on some systems. I hope it covers the questions so far. Let's go here. So typically the first one that, the first place that we go after credentials, it is the SAM database, which is actually a registry hive that is under system root system config SAM. This is very old. We've been, as attackers, we've been going after this since the NT4 days. At least I have since the NT4 days. As local account information is encrypted as hashes and passwords. As we can see here, we go into the SAM hive. Then we have another one called domains accounts. Then we go into users. And now each user here will have multiple properties, including their name, their SID, and other types of information, including last logon time, all of that information. And then their password is actually stored encrypted on as registry entries, and they're actually encrypted with SysKey. To get access to this hive, we have to be system on the target box. So we'll have to look for ways to actually escalate privileges to be able to read this registry key. But once we have access, we're able to use other tools like hash dump from Interpreter to actually get this. Now here you can see it's obtaining the boot key. From the boot keys, calculating the sys key, which is the key that I mentioned that is used for encrypting the hashes. And once it is able to get those keys to decrypt the keys, it will just go in, read the keys, decrypt those, and then just give you the landman hash and the NT hash. Actually, the landman hash is no longer saved on systems. Surprisingly, we still see it on point of sale systems. A lot of people are still using very old point of sale systems and they don't like changing passwords and they're old versions of Windows. And we, from time to time, may see on some of the POSs, we may see a landman hash still there for an account that for many, many years they have not changed the password. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that you need to be system. One of the things I like, it is not blocked by most AVs and EDR vendors. They kind of focus more on the AD side. Now, the extracted passwords, depending on the Active Directory environment that you're working on, the versions of Windows, they can be used for pass-the hash. Sometimes they cannot. Microsoft has really closed down the use of local credentials for pass-the hash attacks. Sometimes they're useful when we want to operate under another account to modify our parent PIDs. Typically, what we do is once we get those accounts, since we cannot use them for lateral movement sometimes in modern environments that have actually switched all to 2016 and Windows 10, then what we do is just brute force those and use Rainbow, either using Hashcat or Rainbow tables to get quite a bit of information there. RecSafe as admin gets you access is correct. You can actually even use the rec command to export those hives, and then you can extract the passwords offline. As I mentioned, Windows 7 and above, they disable the landman hash, and then for well-known SIDs like local account and local accounts that are member of the administrator group, they have been disabled to log on through the network by default. Most of the hashing dumping tools that you'll see out there will work on Windows 7, but on Windows 10, you have to be careful. You have to actually do a bit of testing. And the main reason for that is that Windows 10 actually switched from RC4 to AES 128 CBC for encrypting their hashes with the syskey. So do keep that in mind. Test. I've been in engagements where somebody has used an old version of FW dump, PW dump. They've given me the hashes and they just don't work. They won't crack. They won't function. And it is that they're coming from a Windows 10 system that is actually just using a different algorithm and tool than new. So we're just getting kind of like a shift in bits shown that is just not valid, that text, that ciphertext. One of the things that you can actually look for is the creation of other accounts of interest. For example, SSHD, you can look for Vagrant. I've seen a couple where they are for some automated tools, and that those are just credentials that we can use in other hosts to do privilege escalation, especially for agents and other tools out there. So do keep that in mind, even though in a modern environment, you won't be able to use it to move laterally, you can still do quite a bit of stuff there. In the case that you have used the rec command to export the SAM backup hive and the system backup hive, you can actually use Mimikatz to turn those and extract the hashes. Mimikatz is kind of like my favorite tool. I heart Benjamin Delpy. So you have LSA dump ::SAM, and then you just specify both of the files, first with the system, then the SAM backup, and then it will give you the hashes for you. From system, we extract the boot key, and then SAM backup is the one that contains the SAM, and we use that to calculate the sys key. Now, another method that we can actually dump local hashes is through the LSASS process. It's very old and popular. Now, if we look at the steps that it takes, it injects into the LSASS process, extends the memory, it copies a stub of code into that memory space, and then uses create remote thread to run under the context of LSA to dump the passwords. This is how pwdump, Meterpreter, and Cobalt Strike actually work. If you're running sysmon and you're looking for create remote threads, this is kind of like a big one that will jump out at you. If you're using, let's say, a tool like Silence will actually won't let you access LSASS memory space. It hooks into it. If you're using Trend Micro, depending on the version, it will actually blue screen the host to protect itself. So we have to be very careful, and we have had to have done previously enumerate all of those security products that may impact our actions that we're taking on that system. Now with Mimikatz, we have two different ways that we can do this. We have LSA dump, LSA patch. It will go into memory of that host or that process, and it will patch the API, and then we'll do our request via the API. So it actually just asks for permission to read and write to the memory space, but it never marks that memory as executable. Since it's already executable, the only thing it's doing is it's patching, it's not doing any extensions, not creating a remote thread. And then we have the old classic of LSA inject, which behaves just like Meterpreter and Cobalt Strike, where it injects a piece of, as Benjamin calls it, Mimicode, and it will run that Mimicode in memory and be able to extract the hashes from the system. In fact, let's see if we can pull this from one of these systems. I have here steps for Mimikatz, so let's go here. And let me bring this bigger. Properties, font. I think you guys should be able to see it there. Can everybody see it well? Yep. Okay, perfect. So typically when we have our Mimikatz session, one of the first things I like to do is check who am I in this system. So I go token Who am I? This will tell me I'm system, but I have no thread token. So this is important. This means that even though my process is system, the threads that I'm running are not, and we're going to be working with threads here. So typically what I'll do is I'll do token elevate. And now we have process and thread token for system. And then I'll go into the LSA dump module, LSASS. So quick way for you guys to list all modules. Just do garbage, whatever, foo, in my case, : I'll tell you the modules. And the one that we're going to using is LSA dump. So we can do LSA dump, and then we can do just : enter. That will generate an error and just tell us the different commands. And in our case, we just want the LSA command here. So we can just do LSA. And typically, if I just run it right now, you'll see that I'm getting an error. I'm not getting the information on this hashes, but if I do patch to patch the API and be able to pull the hashes, now you can see that it will work. And I'm getting a hash here for admin and another one here for WDGA utility account. No clue what that one is. And if I wanted to inject, hope it doesn't crash the system, I can do inject, and it still works, and it pulls the NTLM hash here, as you can see. I'm able to extract those from the system. Just in case if you're wondering and trying to crack that password, that is lab system 01, just in case. So let's go here. And here you can see the steps where I did token elevate, and then I did LSA patch. Now, one of the providers, WDigest SSP, that is used for authenticating to websites and LDAP, it is disabled by default on most systems. But now, one of the things that I like about this is that I can actually just enable it on the target machine. And then the only thing I got to do is just get somebody to log in into the system. And once they log in into the system, I'm able to just pull those credentials from the system. Typically, what we do, we just do a rec set on this registry key for the valid user logon credentials. We can set that to 1, and we're able to extract those credentials as clear text, and then just set it back to 0. So here you can see an example here where what I'm doing is I'm doing secure alts at WDigest. I'm getting my password here, but before that, what I did is I did reg add HK local machine system current control set value user login credentials, type reg the word, and the word there, the data is going to be 1. And then I used run as user Carlos notepad.exe. There we go. So I did a run as here to be able to force a logon, an interactive logon, where those credentials actually just simply went into the WDigest consumer. And when Carlos logged in, here we can see Carlos password new system 01 simply got stored as clear text. Typically, when we can go for clear text passwords, we go after those. One advantage here versus the SAM file is that we're actually just if the user is a domain user, we're able to pull those passwords. Word of advice: if the environment is using, let's say, a vulnerability scanner like OpenVAS or Nessus or any other of those, typically most environments that I go to run either a daily or twice a week. Or once a week they run a scan, but it's most of the time it's weekly. If also they have multiple agents on the host, and we can enable quickly this registry key, and we can actually capture those credentials. And most of the time, those credentials allow us to connect to all hosts in the network because it tends to be a domain admin credential. Some environments actually do limit those accounts, but thankfully, when I've seen environments that actually do, for some reason they include the OU name or the group name for those machines. So many times we'll see, let's say Nessus, we'll see Nessus scan underscore sales, Nessus scan underscore HR, or Nessus scan underscore Austin, or Nessus underscore on Puerto Rico, or something like that. They'll actually specify some denominator for where we can use that account, and many times we just simply use those to move laterally. In servers, one of my favorites is backup agents. We enable this registry key very quickly. We just wait for somebody, a new session, to log in. Typically, we have a background running job, just looking for Win32 underscore sessions, and via WMI looking for a new session. When a new session actually happens, we're able to get the information that we want. We check the credentials. We check if that user against AD, it's a user that we want, that we need, and then we'll quickly re-enable this registry key. One of the things that I'm seeing is that we can go into multiple places where those registry key, that registry is monitored by Sysmon. So do keep that in mind. Or if you're using, let's say, Endgame, Endgame is one of those EDRs that actually monitor this registry key and looks to see if you're actually just doing anything nefarious that way. Let me skip that. That slide was not supposed to be there. Another place that I like to abuse, and sadly, this is not a popular one. I wish it. Oops, sorry. So we have a question. WGA util account is used by Windows Defender application guard. Okay, thank you. If WDigest is not enabled and you impersonate would run as execute anything, which provider is being used to store creds in memory? In fact, none of the credentials are stored in memory, with the exception of probably the NTLM hash, and that is cached more than likely. So typically, if the machine is domain joined, you'll see MS1 v1 underscore 0 and Kerberos are going to be the default ones that get invoked. If not, if the machine is not domain joined, then you're going to be seeing the other ones. DPAPI is just amazing. Just one API call to get creds. Yes. And not only for creds, but all kinds of encrypted data, which is something I like about DPAPI. So DPAPI is the Data Protection Application Programming Interface. It is actually intended just for you to protect secrets on the system and ensure that a user can have access to those secrets. Actually, I had a slide with all of the math and the keys and graphs from how it pulls everything, and I was going a bit overboard. In fact, Benjamin Delphi and we've been discussing, also Will Schroeder, we've been discussing DPAPI from time to time, and I think I can do a 2-day class only on DPAPI and attacking DPAPI. It's just that large of an attack surface. But sadly, many attackers or attack simulators, red teamers, pen testers do not use this as they could or abuse it as much as they can. So it allows me to do EFS, file encrypted system, so I can actually encrypt files on the drive on the machine that's actually using DPAPI. Your wireless credentials are also stored in a Windows machine using DPAPI. You have the Windows Credential Manager. Typically, I see this like when you connect to a share and it asks you if you want to save those credentials in the system. It's actually stored in the Windows Credential Manager. Internet Explorer, Edge, Outlook actually store credentials inside of the vault. Multiple applications are from the App Store. The Microsoft guidelines is that if you use any of those applications that require credentials, like a Twitter client, some Azure BIs, interfaces that I've seen, all of those are required to store the credentials inside of the Windows Vault. Google Chrome uses DPAPI to encrypt passwords, and also we have Skype uses this to encrypt credentials in a SQLite database. So it's used many ways, DPAPI. So we can find multiple stuff actually using this. Now, DPAPI is based on sound encryption algorithms. All modern versions of Windows use AES, or either 128 or 256, and use SHA-1 or SHA-2, depending on how the system was configured. Sadly, the implementation is open to abuse. The way we can abuse DPAPI, you can actually provide, instead of letting, let me see how I can explain this better. Typically, when you log into your system will grab your hash, your RC4 version of your hash, and it will use that with your SID via PBKD2 it's going to generate a key, and then that key is going to actually be used to encrypt your data on the system for that specific user. So that master key gets stored in the user's profile. Now you may say, but Carlos, what will happen if I change my password? Well, DPAPI is smart enough to keep a history of each one of your password hashes. The problem is that means that I can get all of those NTLM hashes and start looking for patterns in your passwords. And you would be surprised the kind of patterns that you can see in a target machine. You can see movie stars, both commercial and adult, names being used for as passwords. You'll see kids' names that get rotated as passwords. You'll be surprised the kind of stuff that we see rotated across that environment as passwords on the system. In your pen test, is the DPAPI private key on DCs normally in scope, or is that a bit no? It's in scope. If we can do DC sync and we can go after the domain controller as a target, those DPAPI keys are the master DPAPI key is available to us. So just in case, if your system is connected to a domain controller, there's a domain master key. That domain master key is used to also encrypt stuff, and you can actually use Mimikatz to pull from the domain controller, if you have a domain admin account, that master DPAPI key that you can use to decrypt files specifically. Typically, when I go after the master key, that means that the user has a bunch of EFS encrypted files, and I just pull those back to my machine for analysis. And to get access again to those, sometimes I'll copy the Chrome SQLite database, because the user has Chrome running on their system, And if they're IT or someone else, and I crash or close their Chrome with all of their tabs, they're going to be suspicious and check like, why did Chrome crash, and they might investigate. So typically we'll just copy that file over. We'll copy the master key either from the domain or from the user to our box, and then we'll decrypt those credentials locally. Now, as I mentioned here in the slides, I would say no EDR or AV product that I know of notices DPAPI decryption of secrets because it looks just so normal. And the logging of DPAPI that Windows provides is, to be honest, useless. You get a bunch of data that it got decrypted, but you don't get what process decrypted the data. You just know that some chunk of data got decrypted, and it is just such an influx happening day in, day out that there's no way for you to actually find patterns of abuse via the DPAPI event logs if you enable those. As I mentioned, every user has their own master key. It's right from their passwords. It keeps a history of those passwords that we can use. If you're in a domain, there's a master domain key that you can actually pull that one. Sadly, my domain control that I have for the lab doesn't work. If not, I would demo that one. But there are two main areas where credentials are stored. One of them is called the vault, and the other one's the credential store. Those are the first two ones that I typically go after. And then Chrome is the other one that I go after for this. My go-to tool for DPAPI is Mimikatz. It allows me listing DPAPI keys, extracting credentials from Vault and Credential Store. I'm able to get the credential history. I'll get that as NTLM, all of those hashes. I can even use it to decrypt DPAPI blobs. I can use RPC to pull the master key, and I can do a lot more. It allows me to import other DPAPI keys. Yeah, I can do quite a bit of stuff. Just in case, if you have an environment where the user is using they're doing BYOD and they're using their live account or Microsoft account to log into Windows, and you're able to pull those credentials, it is a long-term engagement. You can actually just pull out of OneDrive their master DPAPI keys, because the way that Microsoft did that is that the master DPAPI key gets synced via OneDrive. Microsoft did that, so if you move encrypted data from one system to the other and it gets synced, the user will still have access. That is something that I found kind of like appalling. Microsoft actually named it DPAPI NG, or new generation DPAPI. So typically here we have an example of me going after credentials. Who am I? I'm running as a user because I want the credentials of the user. So in this case, I lent my laptop to Dave. Dave was using it to access the corp file server and kind of save my access to it. Now I can get Dave's credential. So typically I would go here, privilege debug. This is necessary. Then I do vault cred patch. So I'm patching in memory the DPAPI API itself. So it will give me the credentials in clear text. And here you have file srv.TrustedSec.com, password 10VE furries. So now we have access to Dave's clear text credentials. And as you can see here, type is domain password, and it is an enterprise credential. Now, if I go after the vault, here we have one for Edge, and here you can see the profile where those vault files are actually stored. There are multiple files that form part of a vault. Here we can see that these credentials are for Internet Explorer. We can see the resource, which is login.live.com. So we have an identity here called dkennedy@hotmail.com with the password honeybadger.c. So now we have that that password there to access to the environment. No, it's not a production environment. No, no. I love my job. I don't want to lose my job. Also, if I want, I can get access, let's say, to Chrome credentials. So in this case, I can do DPAPI Chrome, and then I just specify the in file or location of the where Chrome has the SQLite database. And here we can see an example for a URL, HTTP 192.168.12.37, no, HTTP. Username D Kennedy, and the password is love derby for life. So if we want to see that, if you guys want to see this, let's go on. Is it on this system? This one. Yeah, I forgot to disable the power save feature in Windows 10. Come on, you can do it. There we go. So one of the things, here's the one for Chrome. And there you can see Derby for life. In fact, if we want to see all of the commands for DPAPI, as I mentioned, just put colon, and it tells you, hey, describe DPAPI blob and unprotect that blob. I can protect a file using DPAPI. I can unprotect master key. I can do cred hist to get the credential history. Input info. Oh, I need to provide the vault, not the vault, but the keys for that one. I can get to the credentials. In fact, token. Who am I? I'm running as Carlos. Okay, had to make sure. Token. And just in case, this SSH agent is if you're running Windows 10. Windows 10 actually, the last couple of builds includes SSH on the box. And if you decided to save a key via the SSH agent with the passphrase, you're able to pull that SSH key raw, unprotected with no passphrase. Also, if you're using remote desktop RDG, you're able to kind of pull those passwords from a remote desktop file. So, what's the secure ULSA? The one that let me look at keys. Secure LCA and skipper ticket. DPAPI. There's supposed to be one for keys. Yeah, I'm just going off script on this one. So DPAPI system, and here's my key, my encryption key for this specific user. And if there are any cache keys on the system, DP. Here we can see each one of the multiple master keys. So one of these is going to be for one or more vaults. Credential Store, and other places. Thankfully, as you can see here, each key has kind of like a GUID, so we can identify this. So if we go back to DPAPI and we go Vault, what's it cred? Oh, both are requiring a file input. Gotta go back to the slides. DPAPI Chrome takes an in file. Oh, it's Vault. Was in the wrong module. Vault. Here we go, and we list the Vault. You're going to see here what is the Vault ID, and this GUID here will actually match the master key that you're seeing over there that is being used to encrypt this. So that does come into play. And here we can see that one of these vaults is for web credentials and the other one is for Windows credentials. And if I go here and do Credential Manager, we have access to these credentials here and we can look at those. If there were any certificate credentials, we'll be able to see those also here. And if we want to access this or edit it, we can actually do that and just create new ones there. As you can see, DPAPI is super useful. We can do quite a bit of stuff with as an attacker to get all types of credentials, all types of information. Now, when we're going after applications, there are multiple Metasploit modules. I know that somebody complained that I tend to do most of my demos with Metasploit or Cabal Strike. Well, the main reason for that is that most of you guys are going to have access to Metasploit because it's free. And if you're in the US, you're going to have access to getting a demo of Cabal Strike. So that's why I kind of moved to those for most of my demos. So you have multiple ways of gathering credentials from multiple applications. In Windows, you have post-Windows gather credentials. In the case of the OS, we have post-multi-gather OS. There are several there that are also for extracting hashes out of NTDS.dit files. If you ever land in domain controller, more than likely, my recommendation is don't run hash dump until you check what's actually running on that domain controller. The last thing you want to do is crash a domain controller. That is very, very bad. Don't crash them. Customers don't like it when you crash domain controllers. Also, it will get you detected. So typically, my recommendation is use one of these modules. Almost all of them for pulling that NTDS.dit file is going to use Volume Shadow service. Now, one of the advantages for attackers of the Volume Shadow services is that we can pull that data. We just create a Volume Shadow copy, the file's not locked, we're able to read it, and we're able to pull the data from the system. For defenders, sadly, there's no logging for Volume Shadow service. I'm actually surprised at Microsoft. It's taken all this long and still they don't have a good way of detecting volume shadow service abuse. Then again, it's used for backups, so it tends to be a bit difficult. Do bear with me. I know that we're at the top of the hour. So when we're doing lateral movement is when we move from one host to the other inside of the network. Windows provides multiple ways for us to actually be able to manage a system. If the environment is a very secure one, more than likely you're going to only find RDP and sometimes WinRM to servers available to you. In fact, the other way around, you're going to find WinRM and sometimes RDP to servers, and client machines have nothing because they have the Windows firewall enabled, and a lot of stuff is actually being blocked. And also you can go into environments like a security company that will go unnamed, which actually surprised me a couple of years ago that I visited, that actually for some reason decided that for research purposes, we disabled the Windows firewall because that way we can test our tools and against our own network. And I'm going like, oh, cool. And what protocol are you using? Oh, WMI. Did you disable the firewall for WMI? But that's a story for another time over drinks. But yeah, most environments you're going to be seeing WMI, RDP, and on Windows 2012 and above server, WinRM is enabled by default. So typically when you go into a server and you see that new nice beefy server manager, and you can connect to another server and add multiple servers to the new server management application, everything that it's happening in the background is using WinRM. WinRM has an advantage that is based on SIM, which is kind of like HTTP over port 5985, and everything's running. It can go through firewalls without any problems. Sadly, WMI, everything's RPC. So one has to be kind of careful in the case of WMI. And then we have post-exploitation, which is a version of RPC and SMB, which, to give you a story, there was this target, not us, another company went after, and we're having a couple of drinks and with another red team, and one of the guys comes and tells me, hey, we went after this DoD contractor. They had rules for everything. Enigmax from Spectre Ops came out with a new lateral movement technique. That same day we used that technique and it got blocked and we couldn't believe it. They showed us the screenshot of their system looking for the IOCs, and those IOCs were written a year before. It seems that some state actor was actually using all of this stuff, and they were telling me that it was a complete nightmare to move laterally on that network because they had so much stuff just triggering on and blocked. And then he tells me, but you know how we got in? We did post-exploitation, and they were so focused on the advance, so focused on the bleeding edge that they had zero rules for post-exploitation, and we just moved laterally across the entire network with post-exploitation. So post-exploitation, yes, is well known, but hey, when chips are down, it may be very useful for you guys. So typically, the one that is used the most in Windows environments, and this is because of backward compatibility, if the environment's not using Kerberos, is NTLM, pass the hash. So typically, it is just very simple. We just skip the service provider. So typically what happens is the user enters their password on the system. Their password goes into the service provider, or you request the service provider to the connection on your behalf with the cache credentials that it has. And then that hash gets sent to the server in the negotiation for connection. Either a web server actually uses some type of RPC, same for WinRM, same for multiple hosts, and especially if you have an environment that sadly everybody decides to configure everything with IPs instead of FQDNs, you're kind of downgrading from Kerberos all the way down to NTLM. So in many of those environments, just to work, NTLM is kind of like supported or enabled. What you're actually just doing is you're just skipping that service provider and you're providing that hash by hand. Metasploit actually provides you multiple modules that you can use for this. You have post-exploitation, PSH. You have exploit Windows local WMI, where you can actually just give it as a hash as a password. We have WinRM login, SMB login. We have current user PSXec, which uses the current user token to connect to the other host. But one of the things that you have to make sure is that you actually create routes in your Metasploit environment. I covered that during the network enumeration presentation. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that Microsoft in Windows 2012 and above, kind of like to protect text credentials are stored by the TrustedSec provider in memory, has a very aggressive garbage collection engine, and they added another feature, which is for admins to be able to log on into the target host, and then that host, the host credentials are the ones used to connect to the third party. It is a new feature. So when you're using the MSTC client, it just has a new flag for you to connect. Couldn't get current user PSXec or WinRM login to work most of the time. Yes, same for me, and especially WinRM login, because sadly, when Light Cuisine wrote that module, he didn't add Kerberos support. So the environment has to be downgraded to use basic or use digest. I've only been able to use WinRM login only once, and that environment was that it was using, I believe that it was using Chef or Puppet, and they had to configure WinRM to run several commands on the target host, and they actually kind of like downgraded the security of WinRM that actually allowed me to use that. On the current user PSXec, that means that the user must have access also to that other box to run. So if you use the restricted admin mode for RDP, that's when, and that was added in Windows 2012 R2. We're able to now pass the hash against the modern versions of Windows. So we're actually just, now we have a hash, now we're able to connect. Now, one of the caveats there is that the user at the other side, the user that you're using to connect, must be an admin, can be an administrator of the remote host. It cannot be a regular user. Pass the hash will fail if NTLM auth is disabled across domain resources. Yes. And pass the ticket is the best route for Kerberos auth. Yep. Especially if you do work with DoD and DoD contractors that get audited or have a clearance and have to pass audits on their environments. Almost all of them have NTLM disabled in their environments, and they force everything via Kerberos. I know about this because when I used to work at Tenable, I was in charge of the reverse engineering team, and we were the ones that were actually tasked with writing all of the Kerberos support in NASL for Nessus to be able to meet a contract with DoD. And yeah, Kerberos and NASL is not fun. But I did learn a lot about Kerberos, but it was not fun. Not fun at all. In fact, it was dramatic. So typically, we can actually do pass the ticket. In the case of Kerberos, so in Kerberos, we have TGT tickets, ticket granting tickets. They have a life of 10 hours on the system. And then they'll simply expire on the system. So typically what an attacker would do, since sadly I don't have my domain controller, I'll probably have a couple of TGTs in memory. I'll have to check. They'll escalate privileges, export the TGTs, then they'll import in another host, they'll import the TGT tickets that are in that time inside of those 10 hours, and then they'll request a ticket granting service ticket to the service they want. Now, one of the caveats there is that when you're doing that request, you actually have to use FQDN. I've actually have friends that are banging their head like, I cannot get past the ticket to work. I cannot get past the ticket to work. And when I look at it, is that they're connecting to the other host using an IP instead of a ticket of FQDN. So for Kerberos to work, you actually need to use FQDN. So typically what you would do is you would do privilege debug, secure LSA, tickets, export to export all of those tickets. Then what you would do is you, on your attacking machine or another host in the system, a machine under your control, you would bring up Mimikatz and you would do privilege debug, and then you would do Kerberos PTT, pass the ticket, and you would import that Kirby ticket over to your machine. And then you're able to do the connection. In fact, let me see if I still have tickets on this host here. Let's go. So CD, I'm on the C drive, token, who am I? I'm in T system, I have a threat token. Awesome. So I can do secure LSA ticket or tickets. Tickets. Yep, I still have tickets here, and they're from noon. The tickets. Yeah, around the time my DC went kaput. So let me export my tickets. And if I go to my C drive, here are the tickets. And then what I will do is I will look for one for an admin, and I don't have one for an admin. Oh, crap. No admin. Sometimes it connected via CIF, so more than likely this is a TGS, not a TGT. But I don't have one for the user. I have one for the DC, LDAP, CIF, the Kirby GT. Yeah. Yep. So typically what you would do is once you exported tickets, you will look for a ticket specifically for an admin user or any other user. In fact, Ribero's from Will Schroeder, Harmjoy, that sexy bastard. I don't know how he can focus and read ANSI1 and write parsers for ANSI1 data. I envy that guy's discipline and dedication. Me with 3 kids, well, he's single, no kids. I have 3 kids, so he has more time than me. Ribero's actually, you can set it up so it monitors the system for when a TGT comes in, and then it will automatically export that to you as base 64. So you can actually then grab that base 64 and use that for your attack. In fact, one of the things that you can actually do with Mimikatz is let's see. In fact, let me get my slides. I have there's a Mimikatz training that I'm doing. So I've been going deep into Mimikatz. Change activity now. Here we go. Where is it? One of the things that you can actually do is you can change the output to base 64. Oh, I just do base 64. It's not a module. So normally what I would do is I would do In the case of Mimicat, I would set my output to base 64 out true, and then both input and output would be set to, well, output would be set to true 64. And then when I do a Kerberos list export, what I would also get is the base 64 of each one of those tickets, so I'm not dropping files on disk. I can actually just specify if input or output there. So let's go back to this host, and I could do base 64 and then do out true. And now if I do secure also tickets export, here we go. Now it doesn't drop the files on disk, and I do get the base 64 of each one of those tickets that I can then copy and paste in the code. Just copy those so I never drop that Kirby file on the target host. I just simply got the base 64 from here from the screen. I don't know if you guys find that tip useful or not, but for me it was. Let me close this. We can also move laterally with Win32 underscore process and service via WMI. They're very useful. At least for me, they have been very useful for many years. Typically what I'll do is I'll set up a WebDAV server out on the internet, and most customers actually allow that to the outside world. Oh, awesome. Somebody found it useful. Shenanigans. Wagon Dog. I'm going to Wagon Dog. That's the yeah, sounds familiar, that link. Thank you for it. I think it's the one on delegation. So going back, I set up a WebDAV server. I put my executables there. I enable TLS. Everything looks fine and dandy. And then I'll simply create a process pointing there, or I'll create a scheduled task. Or sometimes if the customer has pretty high restrictions, I'll simply forward one of my local ports over to one of the machines that I have control over, and then I'll expose WebDAV that way via port forwarding, and I'm able to kind of create a service, point it to my own executable, and same thing, let's say with a process, and it works pretty well, pretty awesome, to be honest. Let's continue here. So one of the things that typically we do is I typically like using PowerShell. So typically I'll check if PowerShell is being monitored on the system or not. If not, what I'll do is I'll convert my PowerShell script over to .NET, which typically is very easy. There's the PowerShell Power Tools. His first name's Adam. I forgot his last name. He's a Microsoft MVP. He has a very nice tool. I think you pay $50 for it for a year, and it will actually turn all of your PowerShell scripts over to C#.net that you can use. So many times what I'll do is I'll prototype my stuff in PowerShell. I'll export it to .NET, sorry, and I'll use that in Cobalt Strike, or I'll use it with any other tool that I may have available that will allow me to drop a file and execute it on the target host. So with PowerShell, I actually have available to me WMI SIM. I also have WinRM. I can actually just talk pure WinRM, and also I have PowerShell remoting. But typically the most ones that you're going to see in an environment is that at least for client machines, almost everything is going to be WMI or WinRM and no PowerShell remoting. Some people still fear it and disable it, or put controls or other stuff on it. which it's kind of wise to a degree. And typically what I'll do is I'll do something like this. I'll grab a script, I'll read the entire content of that script, I'll encode that as base 64. I set up my command, which is PowerShell.exe-encode command. And then what I'll do is I'll do get WMI object list Win32 process connect to the other computer. So I'm using the token of that user. And then I'm just doing WMI create and I'm creating a command. Also, I can just give it a list of commands and it will execute all of those blindly in the target host. I can actually use those. And also I can, if I want, I can use PowerShell WMIG schedule task SC on a target host. And I can execute those via pass the hash. So typically, and this is normally you would run this on a system to get the new command or have the command connect to the remote host and take the action on your behalf. Typically with Mimikatz, you would do secure ELSA, path the hash, PTH, you give it a username, a domain, you give it your NTLM hash, and then you give it run and you give it the command. If you then specify run, all of a sudden on your box, you're going to get a cmd.exe with the privileges of that user is going to spawn up on your local box. The run command defaults to cmd.exe and you're able to run that on the target host. And I'm over 17 minutes. In fact, there's no next webcast. So do you guys have questions? And sorry for going overboard 17 minutes. No questions? Cool. So we're at the end of the series. Thanks for doing this. Is there more you didn't cover? Yes, there's a lot more that I didn't cover due to time constraints. In fact, the AD class material that I'm working with Sean Metcalf training material, that's over a week long, and I'm trying to look at ways of making that less. With Mimikatz alone, I ended up doing 4 days on a trial run with all of the other different modules. So that's just specific tools out there. And so there can be weeks and weeks of stuff that you can do via post-exploitation. The way I see it is those that have been admins of systems, enterprise admins, tend to be the best post-exploitation guys. At least that has been my experience. Yeah, sure. I'll open my DMs. How can we get that info? The slides are going to be sent at the end of the presentation via as a PDF, and you guys will get also a link to the recording. I'm interested in getting a copy of the screens from the presentation. Yep, you'll get these slides as PDF. Where do we look for your training classes? They're still being developed. Just follow me on Twitter, Carlos_Perez, and when I have them finished and I'm happy with them, or at least I'm semi-happy with them, more than likely I'll choose one of the 2 classes for DerbyCon this year, and it will be the first in 9 years, more than likely, that I don't do a PowerShell class on the last DerbyCon. I'll submit to see if they accept one of my 2 new classes that I'm working on. If you haven't been an admin, what's the best way to get better at post-exploitation? Build a lab. Proxmox, VMware, whatever you want, build a lab, set up an AD environment, set up trust, and then don't do everything as administrator. Read Microsoft best practices guides and set up the environment. and you're going to bang your head against the table many times trying to get stuff to work and do troubleshooting, and you'll go into Stack Overflow and TechNet forums, and you'll learn all kinds of troubleshooting techniques and tools, and you'll have to learn how protocols work when you're doing all of that troubleshooting to understand stuff. So there's a lot there. For example, one of my favorite ones is when you talk to old guys like myself that have been at this since the 90s. The initial versions of AD in Windows 2000, it got hammered into us that if you had a SKU of 5 minutes for Kerberos, it wouldn't work. But then if you set up a modern lab and you're doing packet captures and you're learning all of this Kerberos stuff, and you by accident bring up, let's say, a difference in clock of 10 minutes, you're going to see that SKU error come back, and then you're going to see Windows resync its clock and be able to do a valid Kerberos connection. And now your clock can actually be skewed almost for a couple of hours, I think almost 10 hours. You can have that time difference, and Kerberos itself will negotiate and deal with that. And that was something that was added in Windows 2008. So many times as we're building labs and Microsoft comes with new versions, I like reading the release notes, and I typically find more information there. Also, another thing I like is just going in at Microsoft and looking at the spec documents for the protocols as I'm setting up stuff. PK init for Kerberos, for example, if you're using smart cards. There's one for NTLM authentication via web interfaces, another one for SMB, another one for BOP. They have multiple documents that go deep into each one of the protocols and how they work and stuff that you should be aware of, including misconfigurations. What are your main resources for new techniques? Just Twitter and your internal guys? Yeah, Twitter. The other one is thread intel feeds. Looking what other actors are doing. We go into the VARSTotal professional account and we download samples and look into those. There are certain people that I like following on Twitter and others like others where we get information. There's the Bloodhound Slack channel, which tends to be awesome. They have so many sub channels in there, and there's a lot of good discussions there. I just simply lurk in there. Also, a lot of my guys tend to do quite a bit of their own research. Sometimes I feel super stupid just by listening to them and the different ideas and stuff they come up with, or I simply feel super old, to be honest. But yeah, there's a lot of smart people out there. Also conferences. I like going into Iron Geeks conference feed and just looking at different conferences from the different B-sides and other places. I like going and looking at the material. For example, when it comes to Mimikatz, Delphi's a great guy, but documentation sucks. So typically, if you want to really learn Mimikatz, what you do is you go into the Blue Hat and other recorded sessions of his presentations, and you watch those. And then you go into SlideShare and you look for his account, and you download all of his slides, and then you read the source code. So there's no simple list of sources for information and techniques. Oh, AD security? Yep, that's good. Oh yeah, Chan Metcalf. Yep, sexy guy, great guy, super humble, super humble. I really, really adore that from Sean. Sean is a super humble, caring guy. Yeah, I have him on a pedestal just like I have Will Schroeder and a couple of other Dave Kennedy and some others in the industry. Cool, guys. Thank you for your time. I hope that you found these series useful for you. And I hope that at least the most advanced of you learn a couple of things, one or two things. Thank you for your time, guys.